Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the First Strike Podcast. I am your host, and I go by the Marathon Don. Here in the First Strike Podcast, we strike first and we talk later. And this week, we're talking about Jon Jones. Is he the greatest MMA fighter of all time? The greatest UFC champion of all time? Let's talk about it. Most recently, Jon Jones retired at the young age of 37. Technically undefeated. The only blemish on his record was the disqualification loss against Matt Hamill when he was a UFC light heavyweight. This guy reigned the 205-pound division in the UFC, was champion for many years, vacated the title, moved up in weight, and then became the UFC heavyweight champion of the world, retiring as champion. Is he the greatest MMA fighter of all time? I mean, to think about it, when he first started his career, he became the youngest UFC light heavyweight champion by defeating Shogun Rua. Even before he defeated Shogun Rua, he had already defeated Hall of Famers such as Stephan Bonner. Like, this guy fought a who's who throughout many generations. Defeated Rampage Jackson, Rashad Evans, finished Lyoto Machida, Chael Sonnen, Daniel Cormier, not once but twice, Alexander Gustafsson, Glover Teixeira. It was literally a killer's row of fighters during his reign as champion in the 205-pound division. And when the new generation started coming in and folks like Dominic Reyes and OSP came into the division, he beat them as well. There was a time that folks were calling him the LeBron James of the UFC or the Michael Jordan. However, it was his antics outside of the octagon that got him the most attention. Being at the scene of a hit and run, getting caught with drugs, and not even that, failing multiple drug tests in the UFC, that right there just screamed all types of controversy. And that honestly would be the biggest blemish on his record, that we truly don't know the extent of his drug usage. Was he on steroids? Was he not on steroids? You know, there was always that very viral moment where they were saying that, you know, it was like the size of a picogram, a molecule in an Olympic-sized pool. That was the amount of steroids found in his system. And when I think of Jon Jones, I think of someone that was fearless, someone that was bigger than most of his opponents at the 205-pound weight class. He had such a very technical style of striking with such a strong wrestling pedigree that it allowed him really to control and dictate the pace of the fight. One of the longest reaches in the UFC. And I remember he would always fight with his hands out. And not only was that a good way to control the distance of the fight, but a lot of times it was dirty, man. Like he would eye poke his opponents. So I do think he's one of the greatest, but I think that because of the steroids accusations and him failing a drug test when he fought Daniel Cormier, I think that that's a blemish that can never be erased. I think that at some point, if you put something in your body that is against the rules and it's to enhance your performance in some way, shape, or form, when you already have many natural advantages, like we're talking about the guy that had the longest reach in the division, you know, massive, tall guy. I can't remember. I think the only time he fought someone that was his size or bigger was Alexander Gustafsson. But when we talk about Rampage, when we talk about Rashad Evans, like he was way bigger than those guys. So you have a lot of natural advantages over your opponents. So to use something that, you know, it's illegal, it's a banned substance, and they find it to the point that you fail a drug test, I think that's a blemish that you can't erase. When I compare that to someone like Anderson Silva, for example, at least in the case of Anderson Silva, you could say that he suffered the most devastating injury in the world. Like, I can't think of any other injury that an athlete can experience than a broken leg. So even though it's not right, at least there's some sort of rationale or justification. You know, he came back in record time from breaking his leg, and then he got popped for whatever he was using. And at the end of the day, you know, he came back. So if he's like, hey, you know what, I took this in an effort to heal faster or to strengthen my bones or my legs, like, I get it. It's not the right thing, but at least there's some sort of narrative. Whereas with Jon Jones, he was already dominating everybody. Like, there was not one opponent. I think the person that was the closest to beating him might have been Vitor Belfort or Dominic Reyes. Vitor Belfort, for those that didn't watch the fight, he almost caught him in an armbar. He actually popped his elbow. And apparently they were both juiced up at the fight. But other than that, you're talking about, 20, 30 opponents, and none of them were close to beating him except maybe 2, right? So you already have all these different natural advantages. Why do you got to take anything extra? Like, if it's not giving you a boost, then why are you taking it? And if it was a mistake, then why isn't that the narrative that you're portraying to the public? So I do think that because of those blemishes, I don't think that he's the greatest of all time. And if we really was to dig a little deeper, towards the tail end of his career at light heavyweight, a lot of his fights were decisions. Like, he went to a decision with Anthony Smith, who's always been a gatekeeper, and honestly, he's a journeyman. Like, Anthony Smith is a journeyman, and Jon Jones carried him to a decision, went to a decision against OSP, arguably lost against Dominic Reyes. So I think that at the light heavyweight division, at the point that he moved up, he already plateaued for that division. He wasn't the killer he once was, and he wasn't getting the devastating finishes like he did against Lyoto Machida or against Shogun Rua. When he moved up to UFC, the heavyweight division, he didn't fight against the lineal champion, right? Let's not forget that Ngannou had left the UFC and vacated the belt. So when he moved up to the UFC heavyweight division, he wasn't fighting the champion. He was fighting for the vacate championship belt. And at the time that he fought, Ciryl Gane had already lost to Ngannou. So this is someone that, despite him being the number one contender, he was the number one contender because Ngannou left. It wasn't like Jon Jones was fighting the number one guy, the number one heavyweight fighter in the world and becoming champion. He fought someone that became and got that position because Ngannou left. Completely dominated Ciryl Gane, who was taken down by Ngannou and had no wrestling at all, and becomes heavyweight champion, becomes 2-division world champion, which is fantastic. Such a big accolade. I believe only 10 athletes have done that in the UFC. So big shout out to him. Obviously, he's top 5 greatest of all time. However, instead of fighting Tom Aspinall, who was the interim title championship at the time, the interim champion for many years, and only had 1 blemish on his record due to a freak injury, right? And everybody was calling to that fight. He's young, he has the wrestling, he has the striking, he's finishing guys. Jon Jones opts to fight Stipe Miocic, which I felt that he had earned the position and the authority to call for that fight. Like, I wasn't super mad against it. I'm like, all right, you know what? He's paid his dues, and if he wants a legacy fight against, someone that's deemed the greatest heavyweight champion of all time, that to me, it makes sense. It's not a big deal. I'm like, okay, you know what? Let's give him that legacy fight. To me, it reminds me of when Michael Bisping became middleweight champion. No one really expected him to become middleweight champion. And when he became champion, he wanted a legacy fight. He wanted to avenge a loss against Dan Henderson, who at the time was a little bit older. So I feel like if you dedicate your entire life to the sport and you're multiple weight champion, you're on this massive win streak, you earn the right to call your shots. You should still, to some extent, if you want to be considered the greatest of all time, you got to take on all up-and-coming fighters, all challenges. I get it. However, if you want the legacy fight against Stipe, do it. So he takes a fight against Stipe. Stipe's already over 40, over the hill. This is someone that got finished by Ngannou, had multiple wars with so many fighters such as Daniel Cormier, and then he completely destroys Stipe with a highlight reel spinning back kick, and instead of fighting Tom Aspinall next, he takes a year to do some sort of reality show, which he earned the right to do, get your money, but then he retires. And instead of fighting Tom Aspinall, who's the interim champion and the number one contender who's earned his position, and everyone is considering him the biggest threat to Jon Jones' legacy, he retires. And that's okay, you can do that. But I don't think that he could be considered the greatest of all time because of that. Because of the failed drug tests, because of his antics outside of the ring, right? Multiple criminal charges. And he vacates the title instead of fighting, when there's a hungry threat out there, he vacates the title. So it's almost like when times got tough and, a real challenge arose, he left. He didn't do what Shogun Rua did. Shogun Rua, at the height of his powers, gave a young, hungry lion an opportunity, which was Jon Jones. And he ended up losing that fight, getting finished, and never being the same again. Instead, he decides to vacate the title and retire at the top. And there's been other fighters that retired at the top, such as Khabib Nurmagomedov. Georges St-Pierre, but the only difference is when those guys retired, there were no threat. They took out everybody that was a threat to the champion, every ranked contender, everyone that had a claim to some sort of contendership, they took them out. And the only person that we can even discuss maybe a little bit was Georges St-Pierre, but that's a totally different story because he had moved up in weight. He was in a different weight class, similar to Jon Jones. However, he had health issues, which led to his retirement. So Jon Jones, I don't think he's the greatest of all time. To me, to be considered the greatest of all time, first of all, you got to be retired. So he meets that criteria. But second of all, you do have to be an honorable champion, former champion, and you do have to be someone that did not avoid any challenge. So when I think of the greatest UFC or greatest MMA fighter of all time, I think of 5 names. And these are the 5 names, and this is why. And then I'll tell you who I think is the greatest fighter of all time. The first name, of course, is Jon Jones. Completely cleared out generations at the 205-pound division. To me, one of his biggest threats at the moment was during his reign was Daniel Cormier. He beat Daniel Cormier. However, he failed the drug test. Moved up in weight, didn't fight the lineal champion, fought for the vacant title. However, he won the championship and then defended it. So that's his claim to greatest of all time. The only blemish on his record is a DQ against Matt Hamill. Very, very good case. But the drug test and the criminal liabilities outside the ring, to me, hurts him a little bit. The next one is Demetrious Johnson. Completely built the flyweight division, became the inaugural champion, never lost the belt until he ran into Henry Cejudo. And he finished Henry Cejudo the first time and then lost a very close decision the second time before he jumped ship to a different division, different promotion. Demetrious Johnson beat a who's who, completely dominated the division for many years, defended his title against a variety of different styles, and towards the tail end of the UFC journey was finishing guys. So Demetrious Johnson, his legacy is intact. A lot of folks call him the greatest MMA fighter of all time. I agree to some extent. The only thing that I don't like about his claim to fame, not claim to fame, but claim to the greatest of all time, is that he didn't move up in weight. So even though he fought at a heavier weight class in one FC outside of the UFC, in the UFC he never moved up to the 135-pound weight class, which I think would have been fascinating. The funny thing is, during that time frame, Dominic Cruz was reigning in that division, and they fought prior, and Dominic Cruz beat him. So I think that if you think of the top 5 greatest fighters of all time, I would have Demetrious Johnson number 5 for all his accolades in the UFC flyweight division. The next individual that to me has a claim to the greatest of all time is Khabib Nurmagomedov. He truly retired undefeated at 29-0, no blemish, no DQs, no nonsense. This is a guy that destroyed everybody and terrorized the lightweight division. And when he left and vacated the title and retired, he beat every single contender. Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, everybody that stood across the octagon, he defeated. To me, the only thing that stops him from being the greatest of all time is similar to Demetrious Johnson, where, you know, if you think about pound for pound, or you think about really, really being the greatest of all time, you think about stepping outside the comfort zone. You got to leave your safe haven. He never moved up in weight. He never moved up to the 170-pound division, never tried to become a 2-division champion, and I do think that he retired early. You know, he retired in his prime. Obviously, there were several personal matters or personal reasons why he retired, but I don't think that, you know, because he didn't move up in weight, I don't think that he's the greatest of all time. So I'll put him at number 3. Coming in at number 2, I would have Anderson Silva, Anderson the Spider Silva. I think this is a fighter that revolutionized what it meant to be a striker in the UFC. He had the longest win streak for many years in the UFC, defended the middleweight championship, and guess what? As a champion, moved up to another weight class, not once, but multiple times. Has one of the most spectacular performances against a former UFC light heavyweight champion, which was Forrest Griffin at the time. And it, like, the highlights of that fight looked like something out of the Matrix. Like, he was dodging and weaving and making his opponents look like they didn't belong in there with him. You know, at the height of his reign, he was putting guys away with front kicks. Like when he destroyed Vitor Belfort. Like, that was something that was unseen. It looked like something out of a movie. I think what really hurts his legacy would be the fact that, he failed several drug tests and towards the tail end, after losing the title to Chris Weidman, and breaking his leg, he was never really the same again. And I think that type of injury is something that you never truly recover of. So I do think that we saw that, the lingering effects of that injury towards the tail end of his career. But because of everything he was able to accomplish, the way he beat Rich Franklin during a time that the UFC was growing in popularity, he just continued to deliver. He was fearless, moving up in weight, fighting in boxing. This is a guy that's a complete legend, complete stud, respected all his opponents. And I think the only blemish on him, besides a few losses at the end of his career, was the failed drug test. But to me, I have him as the number 2 greatest of all time, because to me, he was the Michael Jordan of the UFC. And when it came time to pass the torch, unlike Jon Jones, he took on the hungry young incomers, such as Israel Adesanya, such as Uriah Hall, when he really didn't need to. And even though he lost those fights, it was a passing the torch moment, and he just continued to fight till he couldn't anymore. So I have nothing but respect for him. I have him as my personal number 2. And now, drum roll please. To me, to the First Strike podcast, the number 1 greatest fighter of all time is Georges St-Pierre. GSP. GSP never failed a drug test, never had any sort of criminal anything outside of the ring, never had any problems, and guess what? Lost twice, avenged both losses, went on one of the longest winning streaks, defended the title in the welterweight division for many years, and at the height of his powers, moved up to the middleweight division and finished the lineal UFC middleweight champion, which was Michael Bisping at the time. That, to me, makes him the greatest of all time. The way that he carried himself in the octagon, outside the octagon, with respect, never dodged any opponent, fought Johnny Hendricks at the height of his powers, fought Dan Hardy, fought a who's who, Josh Koscheck, Matt Hughes, BJ Penn, whoever was the number 1 contender at the time, whether they were a wrestler or striker, he fought them. He has one of the greatest mixed martial art minds of all times, because what he would do is he would play to his opponent's weakness. If the guy was a grappler, he would strike with them. If the guy was a striker, he would grapple with them. And I feel like that strategic element is something that sometimes get lost in translation, where we have, even most recently with Charles Oliveira, like, why are you striking with one of the greatest strikers in the UFC right now? Like, that makes no sense. Like, you should be going takedown after takedown, clinching, chain wrestling. And I think that's something that, to me, just revolutionized Georges St-Pierre, being able to play to his opponent's weakness, maximizing his strength, and also using the fundamentals of boxing, such as the jabs. He has one of the best jabs in the business, revolutionized the Superman punch, and when he was done building his legacy at welterweight, he moved up in weight to fight Michael Bisping, that during that time frame had just finished Luke Rockhold, beat Dan Henderson and avenged his loss. And he was a veteran. He was someone that rarely got finished. And Georges St-Pierre choked him out, became the middleweight champion, and then he vacated the title, retired, and never came back. Ever since then, you don't hear anything bad about Georges St-Pierre. So because of the way that he carried himself inside the ring, outside the ring, because he was a 2-division champion that fought the lineal champion at the weight class above and defended his titles for many years, only had 2 losses and avenged both of them, that to me is the greatest of all time. So if I had to go down my list, I would rank them in this order. Georges St-Pierre, number 1. Anderson Silva, number 2. Khabib Nurmagomedov, number 3. Jon Jones, number 4. And Demetrius Johnson, number 5. I think that is the top 5 greatest fighters of all time, the top 5 greatest mixed martial arts of all time list. And the GOAT, the forever GOAT, is Georges St-Pierre, because he revolutionized the sport at the time that it needed it the most. So that's it for this episode of the First Strike Podcast. I hope you enjoyed my analysis. That is my greatest of all time list. What is yours? Tune in Every single Monday, we drop a new episode of the First Strike Podcast. Here on the First Strike Podcast, we strike first, we talk later. Make sure you subscribe, you like, and definitely tune in to the channel for tons of content. Every single day, we drop shorts, and every single week, we drop a brand new podcast episode. Thank you, guys. Have a great day.